2.
We're
We're
live.
here.
Welcome to Breakfast in Biology. This is day 47, meaning we have tomorrow left and 4 days next week because you have off school on Monday. Having off school during this time is really strange, but you do.
Yeah, we had to ask.
Yeah, because we weren't sure, so we're not going to be streaming on Monday.
Yeah.
Who's here today?
I see.
Home base. Go ahead.
Emily, Annie, Maya, Alexia, Darius, Eli, Lexi, Jessica, Abby, Zuli, Mrs. Clayball.
Mrs. Clayball, she figured out how to type in the chat. Yay!
Do it anyways. Do it anyways. What do you want us to do? Keep going all summer?
Don't answer that.
Corbin? Is that a bounty?
I don't know.
And Gladys. So how many emails did you get? I got a few that said, what is this bounty bonus? And I said, well, that tells me you haven't been watching the live streams. Ha-ha! Way to call yourselves out if you haven't been watching it to ask what the bonus is.
Right. Give them a second. Ashton Yeager here again.
Woo!
So, we've been talking evolution. Damn, there it is. We're going to keep talking about it.
I'll give you some evidence today.
Bounties are called at the end, Corbin.
Yes, truth.
True story. Bounties are called at the end. We do not take any bounties until the end. All right, so evolution. This is going to be really interesting. I think this is one of the mind-blown days. We've talked a little bit about the mechanism. We talked about Darwin. We talked about how Darwin sailed around the world, how he started to notice, like, hey, all these birds look kind of the same. Hey, all these turtles look kind of the same, but there's slight differences. And I think, maybe just possibly species are changing.
Dun, dun, dun.
And then he came up with the idea of natural selection. So Mrs. Smith went through the idea of natural selection the other day. We talked about, the mechanism for that organisms overproduce, that they make more than can survive, that there's a high mortality rate, and the ones that are best fit survive. The whole giraffe thing Mrs. Smith talked about was brilliant yesterday.
And it's not just surviving, it's being able to survive and then reproduce.
She has it. Right? And that was brilliant because it's not like their necks are getting longer because the trees are getting taller. It's the ones with the longer necks are the ones that pass on that gene. And so now we have kind of a mechanism. And we're going to talk about more mechanisms later next week probably. But now we kind of have a mechanism. We have a way that this happens. So what evidence is out there that says all of these organisms, bacteria, protists, fungus, plants, animals, what things are out there that says all of these organisms are related? That there's like common themes that we see, and we can actually start to like draw lines and go, well, this thing is more closely related to this thing, and this thing is more closely related to this thing. What is that evidence? And this is the thing that really kind of blew my mind at one point, because it's pretty good. So, evidence for evolution. You ready? You ready, Mrs. Smith?
Ready, Freddie.
Got to be on the right screen. Yeah. Boom. Let's start with physiological resistance. We've been telling you that evolution is a fact, that things change over time. We've told you that where people struggle is with the evolutionary theory and how that actually happens, but we can see it. So let's start. You guys gave us a whole PowerPoint. Thank you very much. Right here, change over time. You're giving us, is that it? Yeah, you're giving us a whole PowerPoint with slides that show change over time.
And we're going to go through some of those tomorrow too. Don't worry.
Right. We're going to go through more of those tomorrow too. And we'd like to see more. So if you haven't done that assignment, get it in there. Let us give you an example. Bacteria, because we're concerned about things like that right now. More virus, but bacteria. Antibacterial soap will kill bacteria, but over time it doesn't work as good. There's actually bacteria that probably are growing on the bar of antibacterial soap that you have in your bathroom. There was a time when you got sick, they gave you penicillin, and penicillin killed just about every bacterial infection that you had. Maybe not everyone, but killed a lot of them. But over time, that penicillin stopped working. and other antibiotics. In fact, we talk about scary things in the world, but one of the most scary things in the world to me is just how many bacterial infections that we can get that are no longer treatable by the drugs they used to be treatable by. That the amount of resistance that bacteria have to these drugs is growing rapidly. And so what happens when you go to the doctor says, hey, here's your prescription, take them all till it's done, don't stop when you feel better. Well, what happens is people leave the doctor and they start taking the antibiotic until they start to feel better. And then they're like, well, I feel better. I'm going to save these pills in case I get sick again. The ironic thing is you probably will get sick again because what happens is you kill it off enough bacteria that you don't have symptoms anymore. But you didn't kill off all of them. And so the ones that come back are the ones that are best suited for that environment. The ones that are most resistant to the drug you're taking are the ones that come back and breed and build up again. And so with people doing this and it happening a lot, what happens is bacterial strains have become resistant to certain antibiotics, which is change over time. It's a change in the population of bacteria and their resistant level. Same thing with pesticides. When we spray fields with pesticides that used to work for farmers don't work anymore because now they're sitting out there like lapping it up like it's a drink. Like, oh, look, they sprayed us with this again. This is yummy because they became resistant. So one evidence of things changing, one evidence of evolution is this physiological resistance that we see organisms build up to things that we use. Are you writing for this one?
I was just saying, Bert is the best example. People know MRSA. They might not know that it's actually MRSA when they talk about resistance, but it's right in that word. Methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus or aureus. And so that's what MRSA is. When people talk about MRSA, and they're like, oh man, you've got MRSA. Staphylococcus aureus is everywhere. It's all the time. You probably have it on your skin right now. The difference is that MRSA is resistant to methicillin, which is in the penicillin, like very, very basic antibiotic, antibacterial section. And so, you know, when we talk about resistance, like that's bacteria that's become resistant and it can be dangerous.
So that's one evidence. Let's keep going because this is where it gets fun. Biogeography. I'm not going to talk too much about this one. I just want to throw it out there. Many of you know that at one point in time, all the continents kind of were smushed together into one big continent. We would have called that Pangea. And then Pangea broke up into two. And, we could go all through all of this stuff. I took a class in college called Biogeography. It was one of the most interesting classes I ever took. It was in my master's program. And it looked at evolution of organisms and looked at geography and how we can link, take something like pouched mammals and how we can follow where pouched mammals developed and how they've spread across the world and how they moved and how we can look at fossils on one shore and fossils on another shore and find links to organisms that shouldn't be linked together and things like that. I don't want to get too deep into it, and this is not one that's going to blow your mind. If you took a class on it, it would blow your mind. If I was more knowledgeable on it, it would probably blow your mind. But it's an interesting thing to see how, and for some of you out there, this might be a really interesting point. Through biogeography, evolutionary biogeography, we can actually trace like all organisms on Earth kind of back to a central location where they started and radiated out from that central location. And I say that's interesting because some people hear scientists talk and they go, oh, well, he's saying against something I believe based on faith. And if I tell you all the organisms started in one spot and radiated out, you should be maybe going, well, that's an interesting point. And that's all we're going to say about it. But evolutionary biogeography is a really, really fascinating topic, and we're going to drop that. But we got to get into some that are more mind-blowing kind of stuff.
So when we talk about like fossils, okay, what are fossils? How do we get them? What do they come from? You know, we talk about fossils in the broad sense of looking at the bones of animals, but it's also in the imprints of leaves and plants. So when we talk about fossils, it's not just animals. But we start to see these commonalities between organisms, and that organisms tend to have these basic things. And you can think about that like categorization, you know what I mean? Of when you talk about a vertebrate versus an invertebrate, you know, do things have a spine, not have a spine? What are some of the things that they have in common? And like, all organisms tend to have some of those similar things.
Give her a second. Where did who come from? Salika, I don't know what you're doing in the chat. I'm just saying.
Sorry, kids. So, you know, when we look at this idea of fossils and finding them, you know, we can talk about the geology side of that. And that's another really cool course to take and to look and to see, you know, it kind of fits in with the biogeography. Like, not only are we seeing things across continents, but we're seeing things across levels of soil. And being able to say, wow, we've got full periods of time, like based in these same rock levels, and then finding fossils and showing what organisms were around at the same time. You know, like, how do we know that dinosaurs and humans weren't on the planet at the same time? How do we know what organisms do go where? You know, and carbon dating and all this stuff that's there. There's just some fascinating things when it comes to fossils.
And back to that speech we showed you in the beginning where he said, oh, well, the theory changes because we get new evidence. And he was actually talking about some fossil evidence at that point. And fossil evidence, as much as we know about it, I would predict in the next 50 to 100 years, we will change some of our thoughts and our suppositions and our theories based on new evidence, based on fossil evidence, because it's pretty deep. It's pretty deep. No pun intended. I didn't even get a hint of a smile out of. All right, anatomy. Let's look at anatomy. So this is the one that really kind of blew my mind when I first saw it. When I first was exposed to this, I was kind of like, what are you talking about? And so this is homologous structures. And we've seen that word homo many times, homozygous, whatever. And homo we know means same. So structures that maybe don't have the same purpose, right? So what they're doing maybe isn't the same thing, but the way they're kind of structured is. So let's just look at it. And I don't know, can I somehow make that bigger on the screen? I don't think I can, which is a real shame. Actually, give me 1 second, because I really do want to get that picture bigger for you, because I want you to be able to see. If we were in the classroom, I could, and we had it on the board, I would zoom in on it or whatever. If I just type this in, I should be able to find a very similar picture really quickly. And there's something specific. Let's take this one. And I'm going to open that in a new open image in a new tab. And then, so if I have it like that and I hit this button, should be able to zoom in on it a little bit. All right. Here we go. We have a human hand, some kind of cat, a whale, and I'm guessing a bat. So here is your humerus bone. That's your bone, upper arm, right? Look at the cat, humerus bone. Look at the whale, humerus bone. Look at the bat, humerus bone. Here is your radius and ulna. I almost said fibia and tibia.
Whew.
The anatomy teacher sitting right here, so I'm kind of nervous. So radius and ulna right here, radius and ulna right here, radius and ulna right here, radius and ulna right here. So the two bones in your forearm. You find not only a human hand arm, but you find in a cat's arm, you find in a whale's fin, and you find in a bat's wing. Come down. The
Carpals, correct.
So we have our carpals right here in our hand. Carpals, carpals, carpals. Phalanges. I'll just say phalanges. We could probably divide that up more, but metacarpals.
Carpals.
Yeah, so we could do that. But So we have the same bones. And so what I ask you, if you have a whale, a bat, a cat, and a human, 4 mammals that are very different. One flies, one swims, one runs on its front legs, and one uses its arm, right? Very different. Notice, and they're different uses. If you think about the way these 4 limbs are used, they're used completely differently. But notice the homologous structures within them. So why would if you were making a whale and designing a whale's flipper from ground up, those, whatever, why would it have those same bones? And so this shows some kind of evolutionary relationship between these structures. Do you want to add to that, Mrs. Smith?
So, exactly what Mr. Suter was saying, where, they're all the same bone structure, even if they're used for a different purpose. Okay, now the next thing.
And real quick before you go,
penguin
and alligator at the top of that image that we had. You see it? Same humerus, radius ulna, carpals, phalanges. All right. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's fine. Owen's pretty upset today anyway. We just talked about homologous structures. So now we're going to talk about analogous structures. And if you remember to what I've preached all year with the "and" portion, that's saying opposite or not. So you might look at this and go, well, isn't that the same thing? But here's the difference. We're talking about structures that are used for the same purpose now, but are different. So like the wing of a bird versus a bat versus a moth, they're used to the same purpose to fly, but potentially have some different setups in them. So we're talking about, the differences in what it looks like now. And a lot of this comes into things that we call convergent evolution, which talks about species that were separated biogeographically or reproductively, but ultimately are filling similar niches within their own habitats. And so there are changes to fit a certain area. So they didn't come from the same ancestor, but they it gets complicated, I guess, when we get to analogous, and there's a lot of other things you have to understand. But basically, looking at the purpose of understanding that we have species whose body parts are essentially used for the same purpose, but have some internal differences. Does that make sense, what I said there?
Yeah, like if you look down at the bottom here, we have a human eye, and we have an eye, I believe, from an octopus. And so if we think about the evolutionary tree, which we're not there yet, but where an octopus would have kind of split. So if we have a common ancestor, like your great-great-great-grandfather, right? We have a common ancestor in evolution. Octopus split here, and humans would have split much later. So they really shouldn't have similar structures. But the eye, because it's used for the same thing, it fulfills that same role within its niche, like Mrs. Smith was talking about, is actually ends up being very similar. Even the butterfly ring to a bat ring, there's no bone structure there, but the way the wing is shaped and the way the wing works ends up being very similar because it allows that organism to fly. If that makes sense. All right.
So in going hand in hand with that, there's also this idea of vestigial structures. And we talk about vestigial structures. Usually I have students go, oh, you mean like my appendix? You know what I mean? So like we still have an appendix, but we don't really need it. And that's why, it's there. And so it's beyond that. My favorite is probably the pelvis bone that is in the whale that's depicted in the bottom. And so the thing is that there's this impression that anything in the water, it's like, oh, you believe in evolution, you believe everything comes from a fish. But actually, when we start looking at the fossil records and the bone structure and the vestigial structures and all of that, we find that things like the whale actually have a pelvis bone. And so what we believe, because remember, science is constantly changing, as we start finding these things, we're like, wait a second, whales actually developed from, or common ancestor rather, is a land organism. And I know Ashton put in there, and they're like, oh, talk about tiktaalik. Okay, and so the thing is that it's interesting when you start looking at some of these fossil records and things, because there is somebody that proposed that and said, you know what, that's there because maybe it was originally like its ancestor was a land organism. They're like, oh, so what are you supposed to find? This organism that like moved from the land into the water and like looked like this, and they drew like this picture, and they all kind of laughed about it. And then we found fossils of it. And then it goes, whoa, wait a second. So like this joke that somebody wrote, this joke that we all thought is impossible, you actually like were digging and like found a piece of evidence that said that that was there. You know, it starts to really change your impression of how things have changed over time. You know, like there's a bone. There's bones. They were there. And so, you know, when we talk about things that we find, and like, you know, if we go, I don't know if I want to talk about, we're going to talk about biochemistry a little bit, but, you know, with talking about, you know, protein and fitting in vestigial structures, like the idea of that protein of the positive or negative proteins on your hemoglobin. That's kind of like that comes from something else. Do you want to talk about the ear and goosebumps? I know you like that.
Yeah, I love vestigial structures. I think it's a great piece of evidence because it doesn't make sense. It's an evolutionary. You can think of it like this: an evolutionary biological leftover. So Darwin's turnbuckle is what they call it. They refer to it from time to time, I believe, on the ear of a monkey is a muscle that allows them to kind of rotate their ear to hear better, right? So I can kind of angle, kind of like the radar dish on a owl we talked about, right? You have Darwin's turnbuckle. I have never seen you in class going, oh, I didn't hear what you were saying, Mr. Suter, and directing your ears better with your Darwin's turnbuckle. Goosebumps. So the principle behind a goosebump is a couple principles, right? If you get cold, your goosebumps stand up, it lifts the hair up, traps more air under your hair that help insulate you better. The problem is you don't have hair like that anymore. You don't have fur, right? It also makes your fur stand up. So have you ever seen your dog get mad? They're like, and all their fur stands up. That's because of like goosebumps. So that's an evolutionary trait to make them look, or that's a trait to make them look bigger and badder and whatever. And you have that too. You get really frightened, all your goosebumps stand up. It just makes you look ridiculous. It doesn't do anything for you, right? If you get a ball python, if you take a ball python and what are they called? Ball pythons. We're getting to the point where I shouldn't be doing this, but I'm going to do it because I love it. If I could spell it right, ball pythons. Let's try Spurs Images. So if you look at a ball python, that's a pretty good image right there. Right at its so this would be called the cloaca. Its reproductive parts go up into its tail. Its tail would be here. This would be its body. So this is the tail of the snake. Ball pythons have these two little spurs here. And they don't really do anything. Sometimes they, during mating season, when the male ball python will run up the back of the female, it will use those spurs to kind of dig into her back and maybe stimulate her a little bit to try and get her interested. But if you look at the structure of those and how they tap into the snake's skeleton, right? That's where legs would have been. So it's the same structure internally, the hip bones and stuff like that, that those spurs are connected to. It's an evolutionary leftover because they don't have legs anymore. So your appendix doesn't do anything. It's an evolutionary leftover. If things did not evolve, if things haven't changed over time, why do they have structures that they've carried with them that are no longer used. Right? So it's an evidence. So we remember what we're talking about here. We're talking about evolution, and we're saying there is evidence that leads us. All the science points us to this idea that things have changed over time and are related. And so we're looking at that evidence. And so this is another piece of evidence that you would say, wow, that's pretty striking. That leads me to believe that maybe things are related and they have changed over time. And it's the best explanation we have right now. And it's really, really interesting because we've shown you 4 or 5. There's a lot of them. So then we get into embryology. I'm going to let Mrs. Smith talk about that, but before she does, I'm going to tell you, because we're at 25 minutes, I'm going to give you a super quick story. Freshman year of college, principles of biology. I walk into the classroom, the Professor White writes on the chalkboard, he writes, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and then goes on to teach how by looking at ontogeny, which is development of an embryo, it shows every evolutionary step that organism went through before it became what it is. And it is a lie. It's not true. But there is some really interesting things in embryology to look at. So, Mrs. Smith, do you want to...
Oops, I just dropped my whiteboard. Sorry. So one of the things that I like to do in anatomy is put several pictures of embryos up, and we're talking about the reproductive system, and ask them which one are human. And what's interesting is they start going, oh, that one is, but that one's not. I don't think that one is. And then I go, every single one of those is human. And they're like, nuh-uh, that one's like a pig. And I said, no, this is a pig. And then I put a picture of a pig. And they're like, oh, but they look the same. And then I'm like, what about this one? And they're like, all right, so then that one's a pig too. And I say, no, that one's like a lizard. And so why are they, you know what I mean, confusing them? If you look at the embryos, we all start off pretty similar. Fish, lizard, turtle, chicken, human, similar. Now, are some on, you know what I mean, eggs and you know, internal, external, all sorts of different things? Sure, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the actual embryo itself. And then as we start to differentiate, we change. It's like the idea that we're all from and made of cells. Cells. We're all cells. We all start off as a single cell that then replicates and is able to differentiate into a living thing. I mean, when you become a parent, if you become a parent, especially you ladies who all of a sudden have some child in you, okay? And hopefully that is when you have planned it in a long time from now. But, I mean, you go from this idea of nothingness to a living, running around, crazy child. And so think about the fact that as it's growing, we're comparing them to fruit. You know what I mean? Oh, baby's the size of a papaya today. You know what I mean? That like really your baby is potentially developing and looking the same as all of these other organisms. Is that not a fascinating process? That we looked like all of these other things and that these other things look like us. If that's not telling you that there's some commonality in something, I mean, that's a conversation for another day then, I guess.
Well, and think about, I mean, just look at gill slits. So when you were first, your early embryo had gill slits, your early embryo had a tail. There's classes. So in every single thing that we've talked about here, every single thing, you can take a class on embryology. You can take classes, degree on embryology, right? So we are taking just a very thin slice. And some of the things we're telling you why true and make it understandable that if you got deep into it, probably aren't even true and understand. You know, like you probably learned that that very general thing that we said at its heart is so much deeper that it almost makes it like not even like true. Like it's much deeper than that, right? So we're very just general things that we're talking about here to kind of open you up to these things. The last evidence we're going to give you, and we're way past what we normally would be. The last evidence we're going to give you, and thank you for sticking with us, is biochemistry. And I don't think we need to talk about it because you know about it. You know about DNA. You know about cells. You know about proteins. You know how proteins are made. You know about replication. You know that all those processes are in every organism that on Earth.
And we've talked about the fact that we can take, polymerase from a bacteria in order to make our bacteria reproduce to do PCR and gel electrophoresis. You know what I mean? Like,
we can take the human gene for insulin and put it in a bacteria and have it make human insulin that we can use. So we do need to wrap this up because we're at like 31 minutes, but this is just how kind of exciting this stuff is to us. Like, is there evidence out there? Well, I'm not saying that you have to, and I don't think believe in evolution is the right term. I really don't, because evolution is not a faith, it's a science. It's either I understand what people think happens or I don't understand what people think happens. It's not a belief. So you can say, I'm educated in evolution and I understand what all the science says and why people think that this is how it works. Or you can say, I don't want to be educated in evolution and I don't want to understand that. But it's not a belief thing. It's not like I believe it happened or I believe it didn't happen. You can say, I think the theory is really good. I think the theory makes a lot of sense about what I know, or I'm not a big fan of the theory. Right? It's not a belief thing. Religion is a belief thing. That's a faith thing. So you come over here, physiological resistance, biogeography, fossil evidence, anatomy, analogous structures, homologous structures, vestigial structures, embryology, biochemistry. And we gave you this much of the evidence that says this is why we think things are related. And we'll dive more into mechanisms and things later next week. But before we go, Flipgrid. Come on. They're cool. We love them. We love hearing your voice. Adding to the PowerPoint. What am I missing for the end of the day? I'm sorry, I just kind of rushed us through the end of the day, Mrs. Smith, but we're at 32 minutes.
Yeah, we got limited time left with you, and I think that's why we're going a little longer, because we realize 5 days left.
5 days. Wash your hands. Stay safe. Do the Flipgrid. Do the PowerPoint. We love you. We'll see you soon.